billions on the line. The White House hits back with new tariffs on Canada. U.S. President Donald Trump announced an additional 10% tariff increase on Canadian imports, a move that came as a surprise response to the Ontario government's television campaign. This unusual outcome, in which a government decision was prompted by a minute-long commercial, stunned observers on both sides of the border. In a statement on social media, Trump called the ad a gross misrepresentation of the facts and an unfriendly move, emphasizing that it was this ad that forced Washington to resort to tough measures. Traditionally, trade between the U.S. and Canada is considered one of the closest in the world. Annual turnover is approaching $1 trillion, and the economies are closely intertwined by decades of cooperation and the USMCA agreement. Against this backdrop, the outbreak of conflict over a promotional video seems particularly sharp, from the freezing of negotiations to the threat of a new tariff duel that could hit entire industries and the wallets of ordinary consumers on both sides of the border. The trigger was a 1-minute video by the Ontario government. Under the guise of a public service announcement, Ronald Reagan's voice is heard quoting from 1987 about the harm of tariffs and the risk of trade wars, a transparent allusion to the current situation. The ideologist behind the campaign is Premier Doug Ford, a populist conservative who is defending the province, which is being hit by tariffs on steel, aluminum, and cars. About 75 million Canadian dollars were invested in the U.S. release, and the ad was shown on top channels and during the first game of the World Series, featuring the Toronto Blue Jays for maximum impact. Critics claim that Reagan's words were taken out of context and used without permission. The Reagan Foundation and the Trump administration called the video misleading. Ford insists that the goal has been achieved. The conversation about tariffs and their impact on workers and businesses on both sides of the border has been launched, and Washington's reaction has been obtained. In response to the challenge, the White House immediately took a tough stance. On Thursday, October 23rd, Washington froze all trade negotiations with Ottawa, and 2 days later, a concrete step followed. Donald Trump announced additional 10% tariffs on Canadian imports on top of those already in effect. In a statement on Truth Social, he called Ontario's video a hoax and a hostile attack, accusing its authors of seriously distorting the facts and attempting to push the U.S. Supreme Court to side with Canada. In doing so, the president made it clear that, in his opinion, Ottawa is trying to influence public opinion and legal proceedings in the U.S. in order to weaken the White House's tough tariff line. It wasn't just words. Trump ordered tariffs to be raised, emphasizing that the U.S. could finally protect itself from the exorbitant tariffs of other countries, including Canada. Although the exact list of goods subject to the new 10% increase has not yet been specified, the move is largely symbolic and demonstrative in nature. Trump has made it clear that he will not tolerate what he considers to be outside interference and criticism of his strategy. The most ardent supporters of the America First policy applauded the decision, seeing it as a way to protect interests and jobs. An administration spokesperson called the video, paid for by Canadian taxpayers, misleading manipulation that proves Ottawa is playing games instead of engaging in dialogue. The White House made it clear that in such an atmosphere, any further negotiations are pointless until Canada shows it is serious. In Ottawa, Washington's sharp reaction caused alarm, but federal authorities are trying not to inflame the conflict. Prime Minister Mark Carney, who took office in March, has been trying to cool down relations with Trump from day one. In the summer, he made concessions. He scrapped the planned tax on digital services after the U.S. demonstratively broke off negotiations and canceled most of his predecessors' retaliatory tariffs, a sign of détente. Carney's key goal is to bring Washington back to the negotiating table to lift U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum and settle other disputes. But the Ontario ad campaign has put Ottawa in an awkward position. After Trump's outburst, Carney quickly contacted Ontario Premier Doug Ford. Ford agreed to take a step back, announcing that he would suspend the campaign starting Monday to give the U.S. a chance to resume dialogue. "We got the message across to the American audience. We can take a break," Ford said, insisting that he wanted to start a discussion, not break off talks. However, the ads will remain on the air until the end of the weekend, including during the World Series opening games, for maximum reach. Ottawa is now smoothing things over. Carney himself has publicly confirmed his willingness to resume contacts at any time and is looking for diplomatic ways to reduce tensions. He acknowledged that he is not in a position to manage U.S. trade policy, which has changed since the 1980s, but assured that he would defend Canada's interests with the means at his disposal. A common international platform lies ahead, the ASEAN summit in Malaysia, but Trump has already made it clear that he does not plan to hold a bilateral meeting with Carney. The chill remains. Washington is clearly waiting for Ottawa to take further steps. It is telling that even Ford's usual opponents supported his risky move within the country. The left, including Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew and Green Party leader Elizabeth May, called for the campaign not to be curtailed and for the video to remain on the air. The nationalist segment of society welcomed the harsh tone directed at Trump, but many experts and moderates warn that an attack on television could easily backfire on Canada itself. Now Carney, a supporter of a more conciliatory line, has to deal with the consequences and will likely have to make new concessions to regain Washington's favor and continue negotiations. Until recently, Ottawa and Washington were trying to smooth out their differences at the negotiating table. After signing the USMCA in 2020, the partners were left with a whole bunch of unresolved issues. In recent years, the US has imposed unilateral tariffs on steel and aluminum under the guise of national security, which has hit the Canadian metallurgical industry hard. Canada, in turn, has promoted a digital tax for global IT giants, irritating the Americans. In the summer, on the eve of the tax's introduction, Trump demonstratively broke off negotiations, effectively threatening a trade war. And Carney's cabinet backed down, canceling the initiative. The episode clearly showed how fragile mutual trust had become. Any irritant could disrupt the dialogue. In recent months, Mark Carney has been persistently seeking points of contact with the White House, seeking the cancellation of 50% tariffs on metals and the easing of other barriers. The possibility of a mini-deal was discussed, which would remove at least some of the obstacles to business on both sides of the border. Now, after the video incident and the retaliatory tariff increase, these plans are on hold. The American side has effectively put contacts on hold, and Canada will likely have to offer new concessions or guarantees to restore them. Against the backdrop of the crisis, Carney announced a change of course. He intends to double exports to markets outside the US in order to reduce dependence on unpredictable American policy. For a country where the US traditionally accounts for over 75% of exports, this is an unprecedented alarm signal. If tensions do not ease, Ottawa will increase diversification, and North American production chains, primarily in the automotive and energy industries, risk being hit hard. Similar crises have happened before. During the renegotiation of NAFTA, Trump repeatedly threatened to walk away from the negotiations and tear up the agreement in order to secure better terms. In the end, the USMCA was signed, but the current situation shows that old disputes are resurfacing. At stake are not only individual tariffs, but also the overall climate of trust between close allies. Experts hope for a return to pragmatism after a brief cooling-off period. But now the trade track is effectively frozen, and its restart will depend on how both sides rethink what has happened. The trade escalation has alarmed business circles on both sides of the border. Business warns that a new round of tariffs will ultimately hurt companies and consumers in the US and Canada themselves. Any tariffs are first and foremost a tax on Americans and then a blow to overall North American competitiveness, said the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, calling for a diplomatic resolution to the conflict. According to business associations, the USMCA free trade zone has brought significant benefits to all three economies, and undermining it threatens to slow growth and lead to job losses. American trade and industry associations have traditionally been opposed to tariffs. Since the last trade war with China, they have noted that tariffs make imports more expensive and ultimately hit consumers' wallets. Markets are already reacting to the growing tensions. The Canadian dollar weakened on news of the breakdown in negotiations, and shares in companies dependent on trade with the US fell. Car manufacturers and component suppliers, metallurgists, and agricultural exporters are particularly vulnerable in Canada. Now, these industries are closely linked to the US market, and additional duties are disrupting established supply chains. Auto parts, which cross the border several times during production, will become more expensive at each stage, ultimately raising the final price of cars on both sides of the border. The same is true in other sectors. Tariffs on steel and aluminum will increase the cost of raw materials for American factories and construction, which will affect the cost of everything from refrigerators to housing. If the escalation continues and mutual strikes begin, a wide variety of goods may become more expensive. Food, appliances, electronics, clothing, anything that contains imported components. Consumers risk facing price increases and a reduction in product range, while businesses risk increased costs and a loss of competitive advantage. The business communities in the US and Canada are calling for a return to negotiations and an end to the spiral of conflict. Companies emphasize that in an interdependent economy, there are no winners in trade wars, only short-term political dividends and long-term economic damage. As one Canadian business leader noted, the stability of the North American free trade area is the foundation of prosperity on both sides of the border and it is more important than momentary disputes. The confrontation over tariffs is taking place not only in diplomacy but also in the courts. An unprecedented dispute has arisen in the U.S. over the limits of the president's power to impose tariffs at his own discretion. Under the Constitution, Congress has a key role in trade policy and tariffs, but in the 20th century, some of that power was transferred to the executive branch. Trump, who started trade wars during his first term, took the use of old acts to a level that many considered excessive. Citing the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, and his foreign policy prerogatives, he launched hundreds of new tariffs, ranging from measures against China to almost comprehensive retaliatory levies. The response was a wave of lawsuits from importers, industry associations, and even some states whose economies were hit by rising prices. A number of lower federal courts have already ruled against the administration, stating that the president exceeded the powers delegated to him by Congress by unilaterally imposing tariffs without a direct mandate from lawmakers. The White House challenged the findings and secured expedited review by the Supreme Court. Oral arguments are scheduled for early November and are expected to clarify the legality of Trump's tariff strategy. The stakes are huge. If the Supreme Court sides with the plaintiffs and curtails the president's freedom to impose tariffs without congressional approval, the balance of power will shift. Trump will have to seek the support of lawmakers before imposing new tariffs, an outcome that Ottawa and anti-tariff businesses would welcome. But the opposite is also possible. Recognizing the president's broad powers under the EEPA and other acts will give the green light to continue the course. Experts are already calling the case one of the most important for the system of checks and balances in decades. In fact, decisive in determining who in the U.S. sets economic policy and world trade. It is characteristic that Trump himself linked the upcoming verdict to his criticism of Canadian advertising, accusing Ottawa of hoping to get rid of American tariffs through the Supreme Court. The legal battle has thus become part of a tense political duel between the neighbors. The confrontation over advertising tariffs has highlighted the fragility of the current stage of U.S.-Canadian relations. On the one hand, Washington, led by Donald Trump, is showing that it is ready to vigorously defend its vision of fair trade and will not tolerate even symbolic attacks against it. On the other hand, Ottawa and provincial leaders such as Doug Ford are making it clear that they will not silently agree to decisions that threaten their economy and are looking for new ways to convey their position, even if they are unconventional, such as television campaigning on foreign territory. The current conflict is a clash of two national prides and political styles, but at the same time, it is a test of strength for a pragmatic partnership that has been built up over decades. So far, both sides have exchanged harsh measures and statements, but they are leaving room for de-escalation. Ontario has agreed to pause its campaign, and the White House, despite its bellicose rhetoric, is also signaling its willingness to return to dialogue if it believes Ottawa is serious. In the coming weeks, the main arena for developments will be diplomatic attempts to bring the delegations back to the negotiating table, possibly through the mediation of more restrained figures on both sides who are willing to lower the emotional temperature. At the same time, the verdict of the U.S. Supreme Court could play a decisive role. It will either strengthen Trump's position or force him to reconsider his tactics. For ordinary citizens on both sides of the border, the best outcome would be a quick compromise that would prevent a full-scale trade war. There are already early signs of such a compromise. Despite the exchange of barbed remarks, neither the US nor Canada is closing the door on negotiations. The economic interdependence of the two countries is too great for severing ties to be beneficial to anyone, and political leaders are aware of the cost of escalation. The trade dispute, which erupted over a 1-minute video, has become a high-profile episode, but ultimately Washington and Ottawa will have to seek a solution at the negotiating table, not on television screens. As the history of bilateral relations shows, the US and Canada have gone through phases of friction more than once and have found a balance between competition and cooperation. The current crisis is another test, the outcome of which will be indicative of whether North American neighbors can put the good of the common economic space above political ambitions and emotional gestures.